was so much in the 30s about the horrors of Stalinism. If you chose to look, they just chose to ignore the facts because the facts got in the way of their beautiful vision, which they were, wedded to out of, a fateful combination of ideology and narcissism.
Antonia, you're on tour. Where are you? It's very exciting.
I am actually in Cambridge, and anybody who's watching this on a video, you are lucky beasts, because I'm sitting in the beautiful surrounds of Jesus College, Cambridge, which is where it all started for me. And I'm here. I'm going to talk to Roger today about the book I've written about the Cambridge Apostles, the 5 spies who started here, all those millions of years ago. I feel almost as old as them walking around here now. So I have to say, Roger, I feel about 110 today.
So this is a trip
yeah,
down
be
memory
gentle
lane
with
for
me.
you.
Yeah, so I'm doing some filming of these like short videos of places that were significant in the Cambridge Five's lives, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. So I'm doing a few of those today, but I had to come to Jesus as well, even though it has genuinely nothing to do with the Cambridge Five, apart from, I think, as we might talk about the fact that the communists in Cambridge in the 1930s were kind of in ideological opposition to the kind of more rowdy Tory boat club kind of types who they called the Hearties. And the chief Hearty college in those days was Jesus. So that's the only connection. It was. It's much more woke now, I believe. But back then,
I mean, would you have been a Hearty, do you think?
Better a Hearty than a commie.
Says no one in Jesus now.
Says no one in Jesus now.
So just tell us what is the, for those that know nothing about the Cambridge Five, what's the connection with Cambridge? They all met there, they're all there at university. I mean, it's a slightly diffuse link between them, isn't it? It's not as clear as we imagine it to be.
They earned the moniker the Cambridge Five, and they were all at Cambridge, but they weren't all necessarily really close friends at Cambridge. John Cairncross was ever the outsider. They did all kind of know each other, but various members were more friendly with each other than others. The reason why they kind of emerged was because Kim Philby, through non-Cambridge connections, was introduced to a Soviet illegal agent called Arnold Deutsch, who was a brilliant man, who recruited him into Soviet intelligence in 1934 in London, nowhere near Cambridge, and said to him, "Who do you know who might want to work for us?" Because Arnold Deutsch did have this idea that if you got these young ideologically committed commies and set them to work early for the Soviet intelligence, that they could rise up through the British establishment and become useful. And Kim Philby's, the first person on his list was Donald Maclean, who was a friend of his from his communist days at Cambridge, who was joining the Foreign Office then. And Donald Maclean was really good friends with Guy Burgess, as was Kim Philby. And when both of those two, under orders from Arnold Deutsch, stopped being overt communists, Guy Burgess got very suspicious and he sort of badgered his way into the gang. And then through Burgess, it was Blunt, and then Blunt and Burgess between them recruited the slightly chippy outsider John Cairncross, but not really because John Cairncross had much to do with them at Cambridge, more because John Cairncross had gotten into the Foreign Office and therefore was seen as useful for foreign, for Soviet intelligence. So yeah, it all began here, but it wasn't, it wasn't specifically their Cambridgeness that made them a target. It was a kind of serendipitous chain rather than a kind of, deliberate thing.
And as you just said, a key part of their recruitment as spies was that they had to disavow their communism. I mean, paradoxically, but publicly disavow it.
Yeah.
And in a couple of cases, reading your book, which is brilliant, by the way, in a couple of cases where they do that in a very kind of extreme and sometimes very, obvious, has to be obvious, has to be public, but some of them in a very extreme way. Just, I mean, talk us through a bit of that.
Yeah, so they're kind of told, don't join the Communist Party, don't let anybody know you're a communist. You're kind of going undercover. And so, you know, Kim Philby basically cosplayed as a fascist.
Yeah.
He was hanging around the fringes of like fascism in London. He went out to as a journalist to cover the Spanish Civil War, and Franco thought he was such a top chap. He got a medal from Franco. I mean, Philby ended up getting a medal from Franco, from Stalin, and from the British. I mean, he did.
That's insane.
He had the full smorgasbord. So, and Donald Maclean, I always think he's really interesting because he was a very sort of shy, introverted Marxist, very boring actually, in the way that many people who are very immersed in kind of arcane Marxist theology often are. But he was kind of joining the Foreign Office, and he was very much under instruction from the Soviets to up his game and be more hearty, be like a hearty, you know, go out there, carouse, be the type of person who's going to do well in the Foreign Office.
And one of them actually started an affair with a prominent fascist, didn't he?
Well, two of them did, really, because so Guy Burgess had a blazing affair with a guy called Mickey Burns, whose prized possession was a copy of Mein Kampf. Signed.
I've got a copy of Mein Kampf.
Copy of Mein. Is yours signed, Moorhouse?
No, it's not. No, it's not. No.
It's a shame. It'd be worth more. And although actually, this is a story for another day, I think Mickey Burns is quite a suspicious character, whether he was like Philby protesting too much and was actually hiding something else. I don't know, but that's for another day.
That's a book for another day.
That is a book for another day. And Kim Philby, when he was in Spain, had an affair with a woman called Frances Hogg, who was an enthusiastic supporter of Franco and a very glamorous kind of aristocrat. So that was, you know, another. They were into sexy fascist beards, these guys.
Yeah. I mean, there's quite a lot of sex in your book, isn't there?
Well, it's not my fault. They had quite a lot of sex.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying, I mean, it's like the whole sort of the weird interface. Is that a weirdly 30s thing, I suppose? But the weird interface between politics and sex, like the whole, what was it called? The sex pole movement. So, basically left-wing swingers, weren't they? I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it?
Arnold Deutsch, who recruited the Cambridge Five, he was a follower of this sex pole movement. And the idea of that was that it was a sort of Freud meets Marx. And the idea is that we're also repressed.
Yeah.
That once we throw off our chains of both, you know, the evil bourgeois capitalists and our sexual repression, we will. That's the key to paradise. I actually wrote, I thought, a brilliant line about the sex pole movement in my original draft, but my agent made me take it out. I said that the sex pole movement basically abided by the principle of wankers of the world unite.
And strangely, that got edited out. I mean,
edited out.
I think you should have stood your ground on that one.
I know, pearls before swine there, Moorhouse.
Yeah, honestly. Exactly. So look, you've got your five Cambridge spies. You do bring them alive beautifully in your book. And I know, you know, we will come to this, and the gist and the sort of the serious aspect of the book is to try and reframe that narrative, you know, away from a rather parochial one, which, you know, in the British historiography is basically about the class system and the establishment, and how, you know, it's kind of even spies that are working against Britain are, you know, the narrative is that, you know, they're used as a stick with which to beat Britain and beat the establishment in retrospect, which is kind of daft, 100%. But it's where we are. But you try and reframe that, and I think you reframe it very convincingly to look at what they were actually doing in terms of assisting Stalin in, you know, creating his empire, and also framing it to look at who the victims of their spying were. So I think that's a really valid point, which we'll come to. But the five, you bring them alive really, really well. I mean, like brilliantly well. You know, you do feel like you kind of know them.
Thank you.
And it feel like you know them. But what I wanted to ask you, that I mean, they're a pretty rum lot, aren't they? I mean, some of them are sort of spectacularly, you know, garrulous and you know, probably grimly fascinating if you ever met them. But I mean, you wouldn't exactly want them to babysit your daughters, would you?
Well, I think you'd probably be all right with Guy Burgess babysitting them in one sense. But yeah, I mean, I did get to know them, and I started off disliking them quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I ended by despising them, basically.
So you moved all the way from hating them to despising them.
Yeah, I mean, you can see why they were very good company and very glamorous. Apart from John Cairncross, who's everybody's abiding impression of John Cairncross is how boring he is, which is hilarious. But the others,
a sort
you
of
know, they're fantastic.
A typical doer Scott with a chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't. I'm married to a Scot. I don't want to exaggerate that stereotype. So one of the key ways it emerged in the course of my research that these guys actually got information was not just the stuff that passed their desks. It was the friendships they made. It was the contacts they made. It was the ease with which they kind of persuaded people to chat and be part of a gang, and particularly in a wartime London where everybody felt very sort of collegiate and backs against the wall against what was really an existential crisis for Britain. And these guys were sort of making friends all over the place, dropping into various people for kind of pink gin. I identified effectively 22 other people from the records who were supplying the Cambridge Five with information either deliberately and wittingly or effectively by mistake, because these were people who were very well connected and who had access to all sorts of secrets. And then they would just go for massive boozy benders with Guy Burgess, and all those secrets would end up on the desk of the Russians.
So that was kind of an essential part of the MO, really, was the whole carousing and all the rest of it.
Central to the MO, the booze, the friendships, the carousing, you know, the making friends, the targeted making of friends as well, like, you know, setting out to befriend people in the most secret bits of government, which worked really well for them. The other thing was the booze, Roger. I mean, you and I, we like a tipple. I mean, we do.
Are we mere babes in the wood in comparison?
Oh, we're not even embryos, Moorhouse. I swear to God. These guys, there's one night out where Burgess and Philby and a woman called Esther Whitfield drink 52 brandies between them on one night out.
Wow.
I know.
Two people?
Well, two and a half. There was a woman there as well. Esther Whitfield.
That's got to be close to life-threatening.
I know. I mean, and that was a bender. I mean, on a sort of normal day, what we're talking about is a kind of low-level alcoholism of the type that we can't even conceive of now. I mean, I attempted it a little bit in my early days as a journalist, but even I was nothing compared to these guys.
Wow. So, which one of the five? You said you came out, you went into it disliking them and you came out despising them. I mean, which one do you think was the one you'd least want to be stuck in a lift with? Who was the biggest reprobate?
I mean, it's quite hard to say.
Stuck in a lift might be Cairncross because he'd bore you to death.
Yeah, stuck in the lift, Cairncross, 100%. Be married to, it's a toss-up between McLean and Philby. So McLean, basically, we have on record as, he was a very big guy, McCain, 6 foot something. His wife was really, really petite, very attractive. And we have it on record that, you know, he strangled her quite happily in front of people. And, you know, if someone's strangling you in front of people, what are they doing behind closed doors? And we know that he hit her, and we know that he was horrible to her. Kim Philby's wife, Eileen, has often been his second wife, portrayed as being sort of unreasonably mad. And she did do some unreasonably mad things, like injecting herself with her own urine so she came out in boils. Yes, I know.
Sorry.
It's not.
Why would she do that?
Well, so the sort of story of the time amongst Philby and his friends was that Eileen was just like a nut job, right? A mad woman. She's the mad woman in the attic. You reframe it. This woman, there's one point where she's living in a house with Philby's mistress, Esther, in the attic, Guy Burgess in the basement, 5 kids under 6 or something, and a husband who is a narcissistic sociopath. I mean, I think even in those circumstances, I would be tempted to reach for the piss-filled syringe. It's... I mean, maybe not.
We've all been there. We've all been there.
We've all been tempted. But the point being that, this woman was put through hell by this man, and he was a narcissist, and the thing about Philby, which I found very problematic, apart from the whole being a massive traitor, was the fact that he treats everybody with such incredible contempt. Like all the people who consider themselves to be his friends, he's writing little pen portraits of them to the Soviets, which are just vicious and mean. And it's actually, and not necessary, actually. I mean, the Soviets don't care that his best friend, Nicholas Elliott, has a face like a pig. I mean, that's not what interests them. Do you know what I mean?
It's kind of unnecessarily
all his pen
bitchy.
Portraits. Yeah, unnecessarily contemptuous of everybody. And everybody's useless and everybody's stupid apart from him. And his, the book is partly about the kind of irony that these guys were very anti-imperialist, but they were so infused by British imperial thoughts. So at the point where Kim Philby is sending, countless Albanians, for example, to their deaths, he's having a good laugh with his kind of fellow intelligence officers in the CIA about how the Albanian agents that they're sending to their certain death have only just come down from the trees. You can't trust them like you can trust an Anglo-Saxon chap, says the Soviet spy Kim Philby.
Wow.
I mean, so yeah, he's a contemptible man, actually. I can't. Yeah. He was so awful that one of the things I discovered in the archives was his wife Eileen dies of suicide, right? And Philby's absolutely delighted that he's finally got rid of her, even though it leaves his 5 children motherless. And before she died, Eileen's had been seeing a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist was so convinced, because he'd been listening to Eileen talk about Philby, he was so convinced that she had been killed by him or on his orders, that he rang her family GP and said, "Did you check her body for puncture wounds?" And when the guy said no, the psychiatrist wouldn't let it lie. He was trying to get people to investigate it as a suspicious death. And even Anthony Blunt, years later, was asked by an MI5 guy, "Do you think Philby murdered Eileen?" And even Anthony Blunt was like, "Wow, he was ruthless enough."
Jesus.
And this is a man who is sort of considered now in Putin's Russia, he's being turned into a hero. There were statues of him being raised and whatever, which is kind of, you expect this nonsense from Putin. It's part of his kind of anti-fascist story making around Ukraine. But, in our own popular culture, there's a flavour of kind of Philby the glorious rebel, Philby the charming, raffish, self-deprecating guy who got one over on the British establishment. And I reject that.
And it does come across in the book, to be fair, as well. So, that you don't read this book and come out of it thinking that they were sort of cute, cuddly, they may have betrayed the country, but the country kind of deserved it. That you don't come away with that. Yeah. Now you alluded then to the Albanians just coming down from the trees. That terrible line, but it leads me on to that. You do focus on the victims, so that's a way of kind of flipping the narrative and saying this wasn't a victimless crime. This had real world effects in terms of assisting Stalin with his expansionist ambitions, revolutionary ambitions, all of that stuff. You put all of that back into the frame, which is a really vital contribution, I think, to the narrative. Just so tell us a bit about that side of things, and also about some of those victims. Have you got? I mean, some of them must and can only remain nameless, but you do manage to identify a few of them and tell their stories as well.
Yeah. So the problem with all of this is obviously that Philby was working for SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, and their records are closed and will remain closed. So getting a handle on what he did and who he betrayed when he was working for them, particularly in the early years of the Cold War, is relatively difficult. What I did was trying to find him through side channels, through CIA records, US Navy intelligence records. So the SIS, for example, on quite a lot of the missions where they're sending people into past the Iron Curtain into places like Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland or whatever. Quite a lot of these are sort of joint missions with the CIA. So there's SIS briefing notes in the CIA file. So there's so I start the book with the very last mission that Kim Philby betrayed, which was a flight of 16 Ukrainians into behind the Iron Curtain in May 1951, and I found the full details of the mission. I found all the names of the guys that he betrayed. I found the little biographical sketches of each of them. So we have all of that, and I found all of that in the CIA files. What I also wanted to do, as this is a book which has a bit of a pop at Anglocentrism, was look at the other side of the equation. So I did some work in Poland, I did lots of work in the Lithuanian KGB archives, and I was incredibly lucky to have a brilliant researcher called Enksi Becker, who helped me get into the Sigurimi Albanian secret police archives, which have only been open for a few years. So this is like virgin territory. And I discovered in that, for example, the Albanian archives, you can see there's notes in the Sigurimi saying, we have had intelligence of a British-sponsored partisan infiltration mission from the Soviet embassy in Tirana. So we have there a direct link then in the records that the Soviet embassy is supplying intelligence about British operations, and they're passing that on to the Sigurimi on the ground. Now, none of this is to sort of. The Soviets were brilliant at counterintelligence, right? So they made brilliant use of Philby. But another thing, for example, in the Albanian missions, Philby didn't even have to give them very much. He didn't have to give them landing dates, because all he had to give them was names, because the Sigurimi, so the British and the Americans believed it was a really good idea to send these men back to the areas of Albania that they were originally from, so that they could get help from friends and family, right? The Sigurimi, and I could see this in the archive, once they identified, all they needed was a name, right? And then they would go out and target these people's friends and family, so that if they missed the drop, they already had a whole kind of spider's web waiting to entrap these guys. And all they needed from Philby was a name. So you see the sort of seeing both sides of these operations is absolutely fascinating, and how they used Philby's information to play these radio games, which are where the secret police across the Iron Curtain would kind of set up fake organizations, fake partisan organizations, and then they would turn any partisans that they caught, and they would be radioing back to London and America saying, everything's great, send more men, send more money, send more arms, and it's all just a Soviet game that they're playing. And all of Philby's information was absolutely crucial in helping them play those games.
So that using the material that you have, you said Polish, Lithuanian, and Albanian, right? to try and reshape that or refocus that story, makes me wonder. I I suppose there's always language barriers. There's always the fact that a lot of those archives back, in the 60s, maybe when this sort of story first broke, those archives weren't inaccessible anyway. The material was inaccessible. But I still wonder, so there are various kind of excuses why that angle has never come out before. But I just wonder if that traditional rendering of this story as a sort of rather parochial and a rather sort of, it's a sort of a domestic British story of class and all the rest of it. I wonder how much that was deliberately created to sort of to send people off, on a wild goose chase.
I think I think maybe a bit cynical there, because I mean there has been some really good stuff on this. There was a brilliant book called The Red Web by Tom Boyer about some of these Lithuanian and other Baltic missions. That you're right though, what they had, which was brilliant, was access to people who were involved, whereas they're all dead now, right? Whereas but they didn't have the archival stuff. So this stuff has been around. It's just well, two things happened. One was there was a kind of, as always with history, there was a revisionist movement saying actually the five were not that instrumental and that Philby's betrayals were not that important for various reasons. And I kind of debunk that in the book. And also just because this is a story that has been capturing the popular imagination for decades.
Yeah.
And in that world, the plight of these Albanians matters less than Guy Burgess's sex life, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So, not a sort of a deliberate obfuscation. It's just our own obsessions with
I love your cynicism,
our own navels and our own sex lives. Now, the whole question, you last question, you sort of touched on this just now. The question of the actual utility of all of this stuff. Again, it's been kind of quite picked over already, but you're quite definite that this was of direct assistance to Stalin's territorial ambition, right?
It's quite a difficult question, right? Because how do you quantify these things? The missing part of the equation, we can see what they were sending to Moscow. We can see what Moscow wanted from them. We can see, I mean, to a large extent, there's so much more missing, and we've only had a fragment of what's in the Moscow archives, right? We can see some of what went to Stalin. What we cannot see is inside Stalin's head. I mean, it's baffled. It's baffled better historians than me, Roger Moorhouse. Like, what was driving Stalin's decision-making process. The other reason why it's complicated is obviously it is undeniable that the single most important factor in Stalin's ability to exert control over Eastern and Central Europe was the determining factor was Red Army boots on the ground, right? And you can't get away from that. So would he have cemented that control without the Cambridge Five? Almost certainly yes. Were they, however, incredibly helpful to him in how he did cement control? Yes, absolutely. So, there's two strands to it. One is Philby and Cairncross and Blunt, for reasons I go into my book, were very helpful to the Soviets in their clearing up of anti-Soviet resistance in the immediate post-war period. Like, so helpful. And simultaneously, both Donald MacLean and Guy Burgess were giving Stalin huge amounts of ammunition to help him win all the diplomatic battles that were happening simultaneously, to allow him to convert the military victories of the Red Army into lasting political control in over those regions. So we tend to think of the Cold War. We tend to think of it as like almost being inevitable in 1945, like a curtain coming down immediately, but it's much more complicated and much more a sort of matter of toing and froing than that. And what the Cambridge Five gave Stalin is an unbelievable, unprecedented access to be able to peer into the gap between American and British words to him and to the world, and an American and British real positions behind the scenes. And Stalin is a brilliant negotiator, right? He's a brilliant tactic. So once he has eyes all over that gap, he can wriggle into it and work his mischief.
So he gets a peek behind the curtain.
I mean, it's not even just a peek. I mean, there may as well not be a bloody curtain. I mean, at the end of the war, it's unbelievable. Every time I think about this, I kind of can't quite get my head around it. So at the end of the war, when that alliance between Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin was unbelievably fragile, Churchill and Roosevelt were beginning to understand what they were dealing with. He was getting their personal correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt was getting to Stalin from Donald Maclean. I mean, when you think, you just, think about that and you're like, your mind is blown. Yeah. And if you think in the kind of modern spy world, we get very overexcited when like a Chinese spy has managed to get close to the husband of a very low-ranking MP. And what we're talking about is a magnitude of order so inflated compared to that. It's just unbelievable. Yeah. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, which is I'm not overclaiming their utility, but I am making a strong claim for their significance in how it did actually plan out.
So what would you like to achieve with this book? I mean, obviously you want to
sales,
get another
lots and lots
sales,
of sales.
Lots and lots of sales. I mean, obviously bums on seats. I was thinking more in a kind of, intellectual way, historiographical influence, that obviously sales, but what
I'm just pandering to my inner capitalist. I would like there to be less of a sort of cultural kind of wave around these guys that sees them as
harmless,
somehow noble, as Robin Hood figures, as kind of people who were misled by a beautiful lie. Right. They did a lot of work to show that in the 1930s it was very, very bloody obvious it was a beautiful lie. If you chose to look,
it was a lie. Yeah.
100%. 100%. I mean, there was so much in the 30s about the horrors of Stalinism. If you chose to look, they just chose to ignore the facts because the facts got in the way of their beautiful vision, which they were, wedded to out of, a fateful combination of ideology and narcissism.
I mean, one of the sort of, when dealing with this stuff, as I mean, I do as well, with totalitarianism and so on. One of the sort of, quite useful little thought experiments, particularly with the left at the time, is to think about, how would it be if they'd been spying for Hitler, for example, and then you come back to this, what I call the asymmetry of tolerance, that, there's a tolerance for the left, still now. I mean, probably escalating, in fact, which is insane, really. I mean, those two regimes were absolutely brutal and murderous, each in their own right and each in slightly different ways. But the fact that one is kind of, practically lauded still, and you got people, as we've said before, you got people on talk shows on the TV saying I'm literally a communist, and could you imagine anyone saying I'm literally a fascist, I'm literally a Nazi? I mean, it just wouldn't happen, and or if it did, they would be drummed out of town and never seen again. So that asymmetry of tolerance is a thing, and this is another good example of it. So had they been spying for Hitler, there's no way they would be portrayed, in the popular mind at least, as cuddly, kind of harmless, sexually voracious, colourful, whatever they are. They would be 100%. Absolutely damned to the nth degree. So, I think you're doing a great job of restoring some sanity and some balance to that argument by showing up what they actually did. Yeah. And it's brilliant.
Thank you.
And I have to say, of course I'm going to say this, Senior. Of course I am. But it is brilliant. It's absolutely beautifully done. It's so beautifully written. I sort of read it, smiling at your bon mots and your beautiful phrasing, and then I get slightly angry because I think, well, why can't I do that?
Oh, shut
but
up,
there we go.
Lemon.
But no, it's fabulous. And I think it's an absolutely marvelous book. It's well worth everybody's time. So yes, your ambition, lots of sales, absolutely. Go out there and pre-order and get it on your doorstep on publication on the 9th of April.
Yeah. Pre-orders and Amazon reviews, please. So welcome. It helps a book like this to get going because, it's a hard world out there for writers.
It is. So I absolutely recommend it. Beautifully done. Really, real novelty, real historianship, and real authorship. It's brilliantly done in every facet. So go out there and buy it, you lot. Yeah.